Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 470. My name is Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast, a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on the network, please do visit evergreenpodcast.com. This week's interview is with Roger L. Martin. Roger's a trusted strategy advisor to the CEOs of companies worldwide, including Procter & Gamble, Lego, and Ford. In 2017, Roger was named the world's #1 management thinker by Thinkers50. He's a professor emeritus at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, where he served as dean from 1998 to 2013 and was named Global Dean of the Year by the leading business school website Poets and Quants. He's also an author, and his latest book, A New Way to Think, Your Guide to Superior Management Effectiveness by HBR Press, is the culmination of a lifetime's work in education and advising CEOs. In this conversation with Roger, we discuss the premise behind his new book, working with and transforming culture, dealing with received wisdom and best practices, his work with the ex-P&G CEO A.G. Lafley, the gap-filling machine that is our brain, and many more fascinating elements to make leadership more effective. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com. Please do consider to drop in your rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. Now for the show. Roger Martin, welcome to the Minter Dialogue. Great to have you on the show. We got to exchange a little bit before going online about some common experiences, or at least common passions with regard to tennis,
Yes.
Le Canada. In your own words, who's Roger Martin?
Oh, I'm a strategist at heart, so I like to write about business strategy. I am a former dean of a business school, University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, and I now write and advise CEOs.
Brilliant. And amongst them, some pretty darn interesting ones. So, Roger, you've just finished this book, A New Way to Think, Your Guide to Superior Management Effectiveness, which releases May 3rd, as I understand it, at least over here in Europe. You've
Yes.
published already 12 books. What was the instigation motivation for writing this A New Way to Think?
Well, it developed over time, actually, and it developed by, again, we were talking earlier, through dialogue with a friend of yours, David Champion, who is my primary editor at Harvard Business Review. And we've done about 20 articles together. And what we did was we noticed over time that my articles tended to have a form. And that form was, it took on a model, a business model of some sort, like, you know, in order to maximize shareholder value, you must give stock-based compensation to incentivize senior management. That's a model that is utilized throughout the business world. So my articles would take on a model like that and say, this is the model that's being used. It actually isn't producing the outcomes it promises. So it's not saying you shouldn't use that model because I don't like its outcome. It's no, you think it is going to do this. It doesn't. Here's a better model. And so together we decided, gee, we could have a whole book on that theme that would take some of the HBR articles, write additional chapters on other themes where I have a bee in my bonnet about a model that I see in operation that just isn't working. And that was the genesis of the book. And I, if you read the foreword and acknowledgements, you'll see it cites your friend David and my friend David, because he was instrumental in creating the concept of the book.
Hey, David, I should say. So when you look at these models, a couple of thoughts. One is best practices are basically just everyone converging on average. if everybody does the same thing, and or times have changed, we need to move on.
Yeah, and sometimes the average that's converged on is really a crummy average. But I think you've pointed out one of the reasons why these models persist. It's because your crummy result from using it isn't crummier than those of others around you. So you sort of say, well, I guess that's as good as it gets. And I don't believe that in many of the cases. There's a way to do it better, and sometimes you have to change because the world has changed. But on a number of the ones that I talk about in the book, no, the world hasn't changed in a way that makes a difference. This was just a bad idea, right? And the world is full of kind of bad ideas that you figure out later are not such a good idea. It was once seemed like a good idea to make all the pipes in your city of Rome out of lead because that was malleable and it was easy to make pipes out of. And then it sort of turned out to be a kind of bad idea when everybody started dying of lead poisoning. But until such time, that was the model. And it just irritates me to see it. Because I'm sad for the people using them, that a model gets established. A model got established that said, ulcers are peptic ulcers in your stomach are a function of excess acid in your stomach. And so we should treat it with antacids. And when there's bad ulceration of the stomach, we should chop those pieces out. Turns out that that's not what causes ulcers. It's bacteria. But for about 90 years, we prescribed bland diets and ulcer surgery, which in all cases was a net negative for the patient compared to what could have been done. So I just don't like when we converge as a community. In my case, the community I worry about is the community of business executives, business decision makers. They converge on a model that does not produce what they think it will produce, regardless of whether life is changing or not.
Well, so first of all, I'm reacting about the health thing. I'm thinking, well, is Granny's recipes not working anymore? And should we actually listen to traditional Western medicine as much as we do?
No,
I feel like
in a word, no. And of course that certainly would be an example of models that are changing. I mean, there are many things about Eastern medicine that have been poo-pooed in Western medicine for a long time, right? Oh, that herb that fixes that. Come on, give me a break.
acupuncture.
What the hell is that? Sticking a bunch of needles in you. So,
Yeah.
And this is how the world works. I mean, Thomas Kuhn pointed that out kind of a long time ago. And structure of scientific revolutions is that you converge on a dominant theory, and any anomaly is ignored or disputed as an anomaly for a long time until there are enough anomalies, and then you get a scientific revolution rather than normal science. And that's what I'm calling for in a bunch of aspects of management. It is time. There are too many anomalies. You would think after using incentive compensation, wouldn't you think? So that's the first thing. Wouldn't you think incentive compensation for performance has been around for at least 60 years. You could argue 80, but 60 to 80 years. You'd think there would be one study out there that would show a positive correlation between use of incentive compensation and firm performance, not individual performance, firm performance. Because otherwise, I don't think it makes a lot of sense spending hundreds of millions of person hours a year designing and managing and tracking incentive compensation systems, right? You'd kind of think it would have to show better firm performance. I haven't found one yet.
Well, I mean, at some level, the CEO's compensation is typically tied to shareholder performance, which somehow is linked to firm performance, is it not?
Yeah, but that one, CEO, there's no demonstration of that. So that's one form of this broader question of monetary incentive compensation. So providing CEOs stock-based compensation that supposedly aligns the interests of shareholders and management doesn't have demonstrated positive effect. It has a demonstrated positive effect on one thing for sure, which is the skyrocketing of CEO compensation, right? Since that theory came into place, CEO compensation like to like has gone up at least in real terms 10 times and probably more likely 20-ish times. Shareholders, no better. And no hint that the ones that had more higher, more severe stock-based compensation do better than the ones with less stock-based compensation. So wouldn't you, like, if you were sort of watching that and saying, gee, we're spending at least 10x more on these CEOs and we're kind of not getting anything for it, wouldn't you sort of say, maybe that's not such a great theory? But it sounds good, and this is how many of these theories stay. It sounds good. Well, if the shareholders do better, the CEO does better. Well, it's not true, right? So just imagine a situation where the CEO takes over a company and the stock price is 100, and the CEO immediately upon taking over says, gee, I've discovered all this horrible stuff. I thought the firm was doing much better than it is. That wasn't revealed to me, but it's a disaster. And I'm going to have to do a whole bunch of fixing. The stock price goes down to 50. The CEO works for 3 years, cutting a whole bunch of people, cutting product lines, who knows, doing all the restructuring-y things that are actually easier to do than building a business, and gets the stock price back up to 100. So the shareholders who were matched with the CEO, they were there on the share register on day one when the CEO came in and are in the share register 3 years later, got 0, right? Went to 100, down to 50, slowly back up to 100. The CEO gets rich because the board will give them lots and lots of stock options. So he or she doesn't get depressed when it's down at 50, and they'll get a new tranche every year, and they'll make a ton of money. So it turns,
the board members also have stock, and they're happy when the stock price goes up as well. And so, hallelujah, we're all happy.
yes, although if they were shareholders who appointed the CEO, they won't be saying hallelujah, right? They'll be saying, I'm back exactly where I was 3 years ago. I haven't made a dime, except we gave them stock-based compensation too, and gave them each another tranche after 1 year when it was at 50, and after 2 years when it was at 75. And so they made money on their own stock-based compensation. But did shareholders writ large get ahead? The answer is no. And it turns out that if you look more carefully at it, the incentives for the CEO under those circumstances are at direct odds with shareholders. Their incentives are to make the stock move up and down, play that, and pick their exit at a time where their stock-based compensation pays out. So what was the highest stock price of General Electric in its history? When Jack Welch retired with $900 million of stock-based compensation. I mean, is that sort of terrible and evil? No, it's an incentive. Right? You're insubordinate, actually, if you do not perform in a consistent way with what you're incentivized to perform. And he did. He left with the stock price in the sky, a market cap of $444 billion. He did what you're supposed to. Now, many would say, and he set it up for the crash that's resulted in GE not being, a terribly consequential company anymore. It'll be three pieces of companies. Nobody sees it as an American icon anymore that we should follow.
That's for
so
sure.
Those are the consequences of the CEO sort of obeying the edicts of stock-based compensation. But that's just one. I mean, I don't want to make in some sense all about that, but that's an example of something where what I would think is, if this has been around since the 70s, so 50 years, you would have such clear demonstration that this model worked that you would say, we should keep using that model because it works so well, right? It's like going to get your teeth checked up by a dentist once a year. Fewer cavities, better teeth health. What's not to like about that model? It performs, right?
Well, I want to jump in because, first of all, I was thinking about how there's a saying that basically says in big companies, mediocrity rises to the top. And within the concept of mediocrity, I sort of see averageness and the idea that we should hire these consultants because their name is very important or well known.
Mm-hmm.
Let's call them Bain, McKinsey, or whatever, BCG. That's safety. And yet, when I hear models as a general concept, Roger, I tend to think of those as best practices and averageness at some level, because maybe they're the best model available, but it's sort of about, well, me too. That's what I'm gonna copy them. And yet we know, just like the compensation of a CEO, the road to success, I'm gonna say, if I lay it out, is really about culture. And so these models are all very interesting, but if you don't have the right culture, Drucker would say, well, then your strategy ain't going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the two pieces of what the one piece of, yes, one of the greatest delusions of executives is thinking they can do the same as everybody else, all their competitors, and get supernormal results, right? No, it doesn't kind of work that way. And if you believe SAP's posters in airports, which I have no reason to disbelieve, that sort of 90+% of the global 1,000 has an SAP system installed, then you're not going to get advantage by having an SAP system installed. That doesn't mean you can't get advantage by using it differently and better than your competitors, but then that violates your principle of they're doing it at an average level. You still have to think about diverging from the norm. And yes, and culture, absolutely. I mean, it is important to note that Peter Drucker has never
That's
recorded
true.
as having
Yeah,
said.
I know, that's true. I agree.
For
Yes.
Drucker, that having been said, he felt culture was incredibly strong, important. He saw culture and strategy kind of working side by side rather than in opposition. But I couldn't agree more. And in many sense, kind of managing your culture, managing in a way that produces a culture that is necessary for your strategy to be distinctive, is a key job of senior management, a very important senior management job. And as I point out in the book, there's only one way to get a better culture than you have now. And that starts with your interactions, your interpersonal interactions with others. And, Kremlin watching does not only happen in Moscow. It happens in every corporation. And they will watch, everybody will watch how the most senior people in the organization, CEO first and foremost, interacts interpersonally with other people in the organization. And if you come to the CEO and say, the thing that, whatever we all decided to invest on isn't working, and here's the reasons why, and he or she kind of rips you to pieces in front of everybody else, you can say anything you want about culture. You can have any formal system you want. The culture will be, do not be the bearer of bad news, regardless of whether the bad news is legitimate, true, false, whatever. Never do that. You must hide bad news as long as humanly possible and try to convince somebody else to give it to them. That's the culture, and it was produced by interpersonal interactions, and that's why CEOs are so important. Every last thing they do will be watched. Every last thing an EVP does will be watched by everybody below them. Everything an SVP does will be watched by everybody below them. It just cascades all the way down the company. And that is what produces culture. It produces a way that everybody interprets. That's what happened in that meeting. That person was spanked. So you get spankings when these things occur. If you want to be spanked, then do those things. If you don't want to be spanked, like most people don't do that thing.
So that doesn't sound like a model, though, Roger. That just sounds like being real, being aware of who you are, and then in each moment, understand that the way you shake a hand, the way you look at somebody, the way you listen, is how you change the culture. It sounds much more complex than just some sort of simple model to put in place.
Well, I mean, it depends on your definition of a model. You just in the last 30 seconds defined a model for me, right? So that's when I say model, that's what I mean. That you gave a set of self-directives in some sense,
right,
that are structured around some principles, and it's different than the model for culture change that's generally used, which is we will announce the culture we want. Never works. Right. We will reorganize to get the culture we want. We will flatten the number of levels and all this crap. That never works. So I'm saying that a model of the sort you just described is what is the only thing that I've seen in 40 years of watching make something happen differently. But I have that definition of a model. It's a construct. It's sort of an if then construct in your mind, right? That guides what you do. And you had the if then. If I behave this way, I will get this kind of reaction, and over time that will produce this kind of outcome. That's an if then construct that then would guide your actions and help you. That's what a model's supposed to do. When you're about to say, I told you to do that and you didn't do it, you moron, you stop yourself, right? And have a conversation to say, okay, I'm not happy, I'm not thrilled with that, but we need to unravel why. Why did this not work well? Did we have a bad idea? Did the way we rolled it out be bad? Did we get unlucky? Did something happen that we couldn't have predicted? Let's diagnose this. That will then have a different cultural outcome, as opposed to I'm mad at you because things didn't work out the way I hoped.
So many people ask me how I felt when George Floyd was killed. And as I sit across a table from a black man who's about to talk about how the murder of another black man felt, I don't think it really matters how I feel.
Hello, I'm Stephen Dorsey, host of Black and White from Evergreen Podcasts. We'll explore and explain how white advantage, bias, and outright discrimination continues to plague our society. Black and White is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
The song that comes to my mind as I listen to you, Roger, is I am the model of a modern major general from Gilbert and Sullivan. So yes, indeed, the model story works in that regard. So yes. in your book, you have this one piece, this phrase, which I picked out, which is the brain, it turns out, is not so much an analytical machine as a gap-filling machine. It takes noisy, incomplete information from the world and quickly fills in the missing on the basis of past experience, end quote. You talk about that as processing fluency. So tease it out for us a little bit. I thought that was a really interesting piece.
Sure. So this would be like if you were walking along the soda aisle in a store, and you hadn't gotten yet to a place where you could read the labels of the cans. If you saw a can with a very familiar red, the red of Coke, your brain would fill it in and say, well, that's Coke. And if it's a blue can, that's Pepsi, right? That's the kind of thing that the brain, when it's had this experience many times, will fill in to make it easier for the brain to do the work it wants to do. And if your brain, I'll make it up, I suspect you don't drink Coke or Pepsi. Maybe
you are right.
It's not Dasani or Aquafina. But if your intent was to restock your Coke supply, your brain has to do very little work. It doesn't have to get close enough to read the can. It knows there's that's Coke, and you mindlessly put that in your shopping cart, and you're off to the races, and you've used very little of your precious processing capability to do that. It's the same thing that happens with words. If the first letter and the last letter of the word is there, and the middle letters are made all fuzzy, you can generally figure out what that word is. So what does this mean for a company? A company wants to make sure that their customers have the ability to utilize a really high level of processing fluency with respect to their product. And you have processing fluency with your favorite website, right? You're a tennis player. If you go to the ATP website or the WTA website, you don't sort of say, oh, I wonder where the rankings are. Your mind like just goes to the ranking tab because you know exactly where it is, and boom, you're onto the ranking page, and you say, oh, okay, whatever. Casper Ruud is now 9th ranked, right? You have that ability. Whereas if somebody was trying to convince you to, oh, no, ATP.com, and that for others is the Association of Tennis Professionals, the male tour, WTA is the female tour, ATP.com, as you well know, if they're saying, oh, no, he's a tennis fan, we got to get him to use allabouttennis.com. And so you click on allabouttennis.com, you have no idea where anything is on it of the sort you want. You have zero processing fluency for that. You've got to start from the very start and start to learn that. And maybe the 100th time you go back, you have this sort of automaticity that you've long since had with ATP.com. And so good luck to allabouttennis.com in getting your business. Your mind is going to say, your subconscious is going to scream at your conscious and saying, what are you doing? So, what are you? Why did you click on that, you moron? I mean, it'll be yelling at you. It'll be yelling at you because you're making it work like a dog.
In one of another poignant or strong statement you made is that we tend to over rely on data. And I was wondering what the link is between that processing fluency, which sounds like a very computerized idea, at least an image of the brain, and this concept, or maybe of intuition and imagination, which are far more creative concepts. And how does that link into the role of a CEO?
Sure. Well, my objection to data is, again, it's a model where we somehow have interpreted what Aristotle, who invented the scientific method, it was formalized 2,000 years later by, if you're like you, probably you think it was Bacon and Newton. If you're Italian, you think it was Galileo. If you're French, you think it's Descartes. But it's a misinterpretation of what he said, which is he created the scientific method. So if you want to understand the cause of the given effect, you go out and collect data and see what is causing what. But Aristotle pointed out in something that is not taught virtually to anybody on the face of the planet, right? It's gone in the midst of time. He said, but that's for the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are, right? That's for the part of the world that cannot change. And an example of that would be if I have a pen in my hand and I let go of it, it'll drop. It drops 100 years ago, it dropped 10 years ago, it dropped in England, it drops in America, it drops in Antarctica, and you can be damn sure that it'll drop 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, because gravity is not going to change. Pens are going to drop. But he said
pens may no longer exist.
They may no longer exist. That's true. But if you happen to have one, if you happen to have one, but that in and of itself is good. But he said there's another part of the world where things can be other than they are, right? And so if you ask the question, how many smartphones were there in 1999? The answer would be 0. The first one appeared in 2000. How many are there now? Last time I checked, 4.4 billion. That's part of the world where things can be other than they are. And what he pointed out is in that part of the world, using data from the past will not help you in any way about the future. In fact, it'll probably convince you that future will never happen, right? And so that's what's happening in the world. We're having this sort of crisis of big companies feeling they're not innovative enough and being disrupted by little companies. That's because the big companies are busy collecting data that demonstrates to them that things that the little companies who just say, we're going to go try this, those will never work, it'll never happen. And then they wake up 10 years later and the little company is now bigger than them. Unfortunately for the little company that's gotten big, they now insist on proving everything with data. But in relation to the concept of processing fluency, essentially, if you're going to be good at dealing with the future, what Aristotle said is that their thinking involves imagining possibilities and choosing the one for which the most compelling argument can be made. How do you imagine possibilities? The answer is you put together pieces of things that are different than your situation, perhaps maybe a single data point, and you have a way of processing those. You learn how to say, well, that might relate to this. That's what Aristotle said. Analogy and metaphor are the most important thinking skills. That's what he said. And so this is where you get, your countryman and goes to the James Dyson goes to the sawmill and sees a sawmill cyclone and says, I could use that in a vacuum cleaner to make a better vacuum cleaner. You have Johnny Ive, the famous Apple designer, saying, wow, Savoy cameras came out in the 60s, and instead of being dark brown and black like all other cameras, they were all these multiple colors, right? Why don't we make the computer, which we'll call the iMac, in tangerine and grape and all these colors? And so in some sense, those great designers have a different sort of processing fluency, right? They're used to processing analogies to come up with entirely new possibilities. And that's a skill I argue, I just wrote a piece on this week, I argue it is a skill that everybody needs to develop if they want to create the future.
So the literary person that I pretend to be would suspect that analogies and metaphors inserted within the context of stories are a useful model. Yes, very much so. And it pretty much turns out that the brain science is pretty clear on this, which is if I gave you 10 facts and I just gave you them as 10 random facts, and then I gave you 10 random facts of the same ilk within the context of a story, a coherent story in which those 10 facts were part of, and then asked you to recall those 10 facts, you'd recall more of the facts embedded in a story, and you'd recall them more accurately
and you'd recall them faster. So the human brain likes stories. When people say, can you give me an example of that? They're not sort of expressing some kind of a preference. Their brain is asking them, could you get me an example so I can understand that?
In my experience, Roger, I've having run business and seen how it is within a large corporate structure. The challenge in the interpretation or the relaying of stories is to insert an emotional, personal connection. Because if I'm just telling you some sort of analytical story of, it's been told a million times by everyone else, but I don't insert some of me into it as a CEO, the people, it's an eye-rolling exercise.
Yeah, I think it's a spectrum. So I think you're right. I think the more of a personal connection that the recipient of the story hears, I think the more they'll want to grab onto it and pay attention to it. So I would agree, and that's why being able to tell stories and having them be kind of personally meaningful, right, is when CEOs themselves go out and visit customers and can come back to their people and say, man, I was out with that customer today, and half of what she said filled me with pride, and half of what she said filled me with shame. And here's the shame side of it, and here's why it made me feel shameful. She said she liked the quality of the product when she used it, but when she called our helpline, they were rude and dismissive, right? That kind of story, I think, will have a powerful impact.
So you talk about how with Lafley, with whom you wrote a book, and obviously P&G particularly well, about the idea of home visits and everything. At L'Oreal, we used to make that. I mean, that was something of an epic, heroic experience, taking the CEO out, because we put purple velvet cloth around every part of the journey. Potentially he might take a left here, but we need to fix the OAH piece here, and he might see that store, well, we need to fix the front there. I mean, and cosmetic is such the great term. We're very cosmetic in our approach to making that home visit just as perfect as it gets.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely hideously. Frankly, I think that most companies tend to be motivated to do that because, oh, the trip was brilliant, you did a great job, or the trip was shit, you're going to get fired. Well, I guess I'm going to make the trip brilliant at no matter the cost. And Owen Jones said, well, I even know they're doing that, but at least they have the money to do it.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, sort of, in some sense, there's a rule that I apply to life, which is every game gets gamed. And as soon as you know it's a game, you start to game it.
We forget the bigger picture. I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah.
We go to the.
Yeah. No. It's you're right. And again, this gets back to our culture conversation. It's you have to think really carefully about everything you do when you're in that position of power, and there's a reason why I'm sure those in-home visits were staged so much. Is that at one point some CEO of L'Oreal beat the crap out of some poor person for a crummy in-home visit where the housewife or the teenager, whoever the in-home visit was about, said all sorts of kind of nasty things about L'Oreal products, and the CEO blew up at somebody. And so, but I would argue there's a great difference if the CEO is agnostic to that, but comes back from it and says to the people involved, man, here are the 10 things that I learned out of that. I learned we do a good job here, we do a crummy job here, we do a good and what do you guys who are watching kind of think? And if you were me, kind of what sorts of things would you prioritize going forward on that? Right?
Well, I feel like the issue is we still have the hippo idea, and we try to feed the top with what we think he or she wants to hear.
Yes.
And we haven't broken that model by a long way.
No.
Roger, I want to get into...
But I'll blame that more on on CEO behavior than I'll blame it on the people working for them.
Right. Well, I would even argue that it's a little bit along the title of the CEO as opposed to the individual, because a lot of times the head swelling, it just comes with a position of power. You've been successful for 30 years. Now you're a CEO. Why should I change anything I've done in my past? Yeah. They put me in this position because it's an acknowledgement that everything I've done is right. And the idea of questioning myself, that can lose time. So I've got to go with what I know, and I go with the people I know, and I keep the same team. And so diversity of thinking goes out the door. Yep. I've got a set time, 100 days to fix this, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden we're shortcutting.
Absolutely. And then that same CEO then complains about the culture. Say, I can't get anybody to be honest with me. I don't know why. I can't get any creativity. Nobody's willing to take any risks, right? There'll be this litany of complaints that will come out of the CEO. We keep getting beaten up by these diversity people on the outside because we don't have any diverse element to our senior management team. Why doesn't somebody work on that? Right. So they've done all these things. They've got their team of people who look like them and act like them, and who have to perform exactly as he or she wants. Typically he, right? He wants.
Yeah, of course.
So they create a world. I mean, what you've described is a situation of the person who goes into a jail, locks himself or herself into a jail cell and throws the keys to the other side of the room, and then starts shaking the bars saying, let me out of here. Why am I in here? Let me out of here. Right. I certainly made your prison, and you're gonna be in it.
Made your bed, sleep in it. Yeah. I've certainly experienced a lot of this. I want to reserve the last part, Roger, for something which has struck me with my conversation with friends who worked at P&G, and you talk about it in your company, which is the role of debate at P&G. And further, at another time in the book, you talk about the art of rhetoric from Aristotle. And so rhetoric, of course, there's storytelling at some level within that, but the role of conversation and debate. I'd love for you to say, we need more. Why do we need it? How do you do it in a company? When do you do it, I guess?
Sure. So I wouldn't argue that we need more conversations. We just need better quality conversations. And on that front, I take my lead from my most important academic mentor, the late Chris Argyros. And if you could only do one thing, right? If you could only have one thing followed, right, as behavior, the thing that he would say is you must combine advocacy and inquiry in your conversation, and that is what makes conversation better rather than worse. So rather than saying, here's what I think, you say, here's what I think and why I think what I think. To what extent is that consistent with how you think, or do you have a different point of view? If people did that consistently in conversations, you'd have generative solutions, you'd have better answers, because it's an invitation for the other person to delve more deeply into why you're saying this is what I think, and they will feel more comfortable telling you how they think, because they will expect you to respond in kind, right? And so if you both, the reason we think what we think is because we've climbed up a ladder. We've seen data and information, and we've added reasoning to it to come to a point of view. And if my point of view at the top of my ladder is different from your point of view at the top of yours, there is only one way that's productive to solve that. The unproductive way is to say, I'm sorry, I outrank you, so what I say goes, right? Or another is, I guess we're going to just have to agree to disagree, right? But the only way that you're going to get to something better is if I explore your ladder and you explore my ladder. And during that exploration, we both discover new things that would be the source of a better solution still. So
presuming both are open and yet are able to hold their line, because if I'm subordinate to you, Roger, and I say, well, Roger, I think this, and you say, well, I think this, there's always going to be a little bit of a bias to think your thought, Roger, is better than my thought somehow, especially if it's in a public forum.
Yes. And so in that, if you want to have good conversation, there's a higher onus on the more senior of the two to say, so let's say you're my subordinate and you come to me and say, I think blue and I think green. What I should say is, now here's my thought. I actually think green, not blue. But there's got to be a good reason why you think blue, and it may contain something that I just have not thought about, because green is what I came up with. So could you just take me through how you got to blue? What were you paying attention to? What did you think about, right? And that's more my onus than your onus, because I do have a power advantage over you. It's unlikely you're going to do that with me. Now, if you're ever going to be me, right, or me plus 2 levels up, you would have said, after I say, but I think blue, you would have said to me, well, boss, I need to really understand that, because I've done all this working, or I say green. I've done all this work that leads me to blue. You're my boss, which means you have more experience than me. You say green. Can you just take the time to talk me through green? And then if you're interested, I'll tell you what got me to blue, and let's see if we can get a better answer than what we've got now. Then if you say that, you'll probably be CEO someday. But most people would say, oh, I'm too scared to do that. And
would you not say that it's kind of stronger to have that in a public space?
No, it could
just do it one-to-one.
Yeah. It can put more pressure on that conversation to do it in a public space. I'm not saying don't, but I think it's a good thing to do it one-on-one. And it all comes down to, are you genuinely curious about the other person's point of view?
Genuine curiosity, such an important term.
So if this is why on diversity, right? I have a view on that says this whole push for more diverse management teams has a decent chance of ending badly, because we're putting diversity along with conversational styles that are anti-diverse, right? And so it's just going to end up being frustrating. I think diversity can make a huge positive difference in company performance, but only if we teach people how to make the most of diverse opinions. So let's just say, for sake of argument, that subordinate in the blue-green situation who's into blue is, a South Asian, and thinks blue because experiences in Indian, he or she's been working in the Indian sub for that many, and has a whole bunch of experiences from them that the green guy just doesn't imagine, right? If the green guy isn't curious about how did you get to blue, and you know what, I've been to India twice, he spent 10 years in our Indian sub, and then he went to the UK sub, and then he went to the Korean sub, and now he's here at head office in Canada. Man, I'm curious why, what is it about that got him to blue? If you got that, then diversity is awesome. Awesome.
On these wonderful words, Roger, I'm thinking that the Indian would probably have green because the flag, and the American might have blue because the flag, but let's just leave it at that and allow for a smile, some good sense of humor. Roger, please, thank you so much for being on my show and sharing your thoughts. Your book, A New Way to Think, Your Guide to Superior Management Effectiveness. How can someone track you down, follow what you're up to, and or connect with you as you see fit?
Sure. 3 ways. I would say, 1, I've organized all my writing on my website. So that's www.rogerl. You have to remember my middle initial.
L stands for?
Lloyd. Yes.
Lloyd. Roger Lloyd. Not David Lloyd. Roger Lloyd.
No, so it's rogerlmartin.com. If it's Roger Martin, you'll get a real estate agent in Houston who is very, very kind and generous and forwards things to me. But so www.rogerlmartin.com. I have Twitter is @RogerLMartin. And I've been writing a Medium series, which I referred to earlier. Every Monday for the last 75 weeks, I've written a piece on Medium on playing to win practitioner insights, and that's another way to see what I'm thinking. And the one that I just did on Monday was on analogy, which we came to. The next is going to be disruption. So on Monday, look for how to think about disruption.
I'll be putting those in the show notes, Roger. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing your thoughts.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this, and I'd do it again.
Thanks for having listened to this episode of the Minter Dialogue podcast. If you like the show and would like to support me, please consider a donation on patreon.com/MinterDial. You can also subscribe on your favorite podcast service. And as ever, rating and reviews are the real currency for podcasts. You'll find the show notes with over 2,000 and more blog posts on minterdial.com. Check out my documentary film and 4 books, including my last one, You Lead, How Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free. Trust is the reason, still I won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man, building an urge. I'm a convinced man, to live and die submerged. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle with deceit. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free. Trust in my reason and let me show you why. I'm a convinced man, practicing my lines. I'm a convinced man, here in these confines. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, admit to the test. I'm a convinced man. I'm ready for an arrest. I'm a convinced man in the arms of a woman.
So many people ask me how I felt when George Floyd was killed. And as I sit across a table from a black man who's about to talk about how the murder of another black man felt, I don't think it really matters how I feel.
Hello, I'm Stephen Dorsey, host of Black and White from Evergreen Podcasts. We'll explore and explain how white advantage, bias, and outright discrimination continues to plague our society. Black and White is available wherever you listen to podcasts.